Hi, everyone. On behalf of everyone at the Center for Brain Health, welcome to Frontiers of Brain Health, where we take a deep dive into some of the most exciting new developments in brain research. I'm Dr. Julie Fratantoni, and I'm head of operations for the Brain Health Project, which is an exciting study seeking to define, measure, and improve brain health across the lifespan. So I just want to mention that we will have a few minutes at the end to be able to answer questions. So for those of you tuning in virtually, be sure to drop your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll get to that. And this presentation will also be recorded. All right, so for those of you who don't know much about us, the Center for Brain Health is a cognitive neuroscience research center at the University of Texas at Dallas, and we have dedicated the past 3 decades to exploring neuroplasticity and the brain's amazing lifelong potential to get stronger and work better. So now I would like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Anila DeMello is an assistant professor at the John Heighten and a John Heighten Scholar in Autism Research in the Department of Psychiatry and O'Donnell Brain Institute at UT Southwestern. She's also faculty within the Department of Psychology at the University of Texas at Dallas. Dr. DeMello's research combines tools from cognitive neuroscience, psychiatry, and developmental psychology to elucidate brain circuits and mechanisms that support language and cognition in humans. Her lab applies these tools to understand how these circuits differ in neurodevelopmental disorders such as autism. Dr. DeMello is particularly interested in the role of the cerebrocerebellar circuits in language, cognition, development, and disorders. So it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Anila DeMello.
Hello, I'm really happy to be here today talking to you about the best part of the brain. This is the cerebellum, and this is a region of the brain that has historically been considered really important for motor behavior and very, very understudied in cognition. So I want to talk to you today about our research showing that the cerebellum plays a big role in cognition, development, and disorders. And so just a bit of a roadmap. I want to talk to you about why we should even care about the cerebellum when it comes to cognition. And then I'll show you some neuroimaging evidence that we've collected for cerebellar contributions to the highest levels of cognitive processing. And then I'll tell you how we've mechanistically explored cerebellar contributions to higher order cognition. And lastly, how we think the cerebellum might be playing a role in development and in neurodevelopmental disorders. Whoops. Okay, so I want to start by telling you a story, and this is a story that I'm going to call A Tale of Two Women. And so one woman over here is missing a large chunk of her brain. She's missing her entire left temporal lobe, okay? And this is really the seat of language ability in most individuals. But what's striking about this individual is that this had very little effect actually on her language ability. So she successfully completed college, grad school, she has an incredible vocabulary, and is even bilingual in a second language that she learned, okay? And this is very different than another woman who I want to tell you about. This is a woman who discovered at age 24 that she was missing her entire cerebellum, okay? And this woman had a very different developmental trajectory. She couldn't stand until she was 4 years old, or walk without assistance until she was 7. She never ran or jumped. And so her motor behavior is obviously impacted, as is, though, her language behavior. So her speech wasn't intelligible until 6, and she never started school. And what's especially interesting is that this was a lifelong issue. So even into adulthood, she's having issues with language and motor behaviors. And so even though our intuition is that this region of the brain is really only important for motor behaviors, there's probably something else going on here. But the truth is, we actually know very little about what that is. We know very little about the cognitive cerebellum. And so these are 2 case studies, but I want to give you some data-driven metrics about how little we know about the cerebellum. So this is a PubMed search I did some time ago, looking at terms. These are search results for terms of cerebellum versus cerebral cortex. And what you can see is that terms related to cerebellum make up only about 18% of the search results in PubMed. And this is in comparison to 80% or more of search terms that are related to the cerebral cortex, all right? What's striking, though, about this is that it's in direct opposition to the actual physical organization of the brain. So it turns out that in the brain, 80% of the neurons actually live in the cerebellum, and only 20% of the neurons live in the cerebral cortex. Okay? And so in my lab, we are really interested in language and cognition. We're interested in how language is produced and comprehended. We're interested in how language is used to communicate with others. And we're interested in how language and social cognition develop across the lifespan. And in particular, we're interested in the cerebellum's role in all of these aspects of language and cognition, and how differences in cerebellar circuits might be particularly important for neurodevelopmental conditions of language. Of language and cognition, such as autism. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that we should care at least a little bit about the cerebellum. And now I want to give you some neuroimaging evidence for cerebellar contributions to cognition. Before I do that, though, I want to give you a primer so that we're all on the same page when it comes to the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is made up of 3 lobes, an anterior lobe up there in yellow at the top, a large posterior lobe, and a lobe called the flocculonodular lobe. And each of these lobes is further subdivided into a number of lobules, which are numbered there for you. And these lobules are contralaterally connected to the cerebral cortex. So that means that the right cerebellum is connected to the left cerebral cortex via a series of closed-loop circuits. And we obviously know that the cerebellum is important for motor behavior. And in fact, inside the cerebellum, you have somatomotor representations of the body, for example, in this anterior lobe. For those of you that don't know, this is the cerebellum here, back at the back of the brain. Okay, but I've also told you that the cerebellum contains 80% of the neurons in the brain and over 50% of the neurons in the entire central nervous system. So maybe it's doing something else as well. And it wasn't until the advent of neuroimaging that we really started to realize that yes, while these anterior regions of the cerebellum here in blue are functionally and anatomically connected to somatomotor regions of the cerebral cortex, actually, the vast majority of the cerebellum is functionally and anatomically connected to non-motor regions of the cerebral cortex. These are regions like the prefrontal cortex, which we know are important for thought and for language. And this is clearly a challenge to the canonical view about the cerebellum. And this is particularly true of these large posterolateral regions of the cerebellum, which have expanded in time along with the expansion of the prefrontal cortex in phylogenetically newer species like us. And in fact, when you do neuroimaging of the cerebellum, what you realize is that different cerebellar regions are maximally engaged by different kinds of tasks. And this is just like what you see in the cerebral cortex. And over time, this functional topography of the cerebellum has really evolved. And now we can individually and discretely map very fine cognitive functions onto different regions of the cerebellum. And I want to draw your attention to just how much of the cerebellum is devoted to language. So here, language is represented in the right cerebellum, which connects to the left cerebral cortex, which we know houses language in humans. So another challenge then to this canonical idea about the cerebellum as a motor structure comes from patient studies. And what we realize from patient studies is that yes, while damage to the anterior cerebellum, the motor cerebellum, can cause motor issues, actually damage to the posterior cerebellum can cause cognitive issues in the absence of any motor issues at all. Okay? And so as a graduate student, and today, I was really interested in these kinds of findings. And in particular, I was interested in determining whether or not the cerebellum might also contribute to the highest aspects of language processing, things like semantics or understanding meaning and comprehension. And so one way that we can look at meaning in the brain is through a sentence completion or sentence comprehension task. And this task requires participants to read a number of words and make a judgment about which word might best complete that sentence. So it clearly involves some sort of comprehension. And when you do this kind of task, we find, okay, you get these beautiful left hemisphere language regions that we know are involved in sentence comprehension. But what we found is that actually you get equally strong activation in the cerebellum, and primarily in parts of the cerebellum here on the right called CRUS1 and CRUS2. But beyond just being involved in sentence completion, we also found evidence that the cerebellum was involved in very, very difficult aspects of semantic comprehension. So for example, in judgments of semantic plausibility, where participants are asked to determine whether or not a sentence is semantically plausible, like bulls charge with great ferocity, or semantically implausible, like the donut sweeps the steps, when both of these sentences are grammatically correct, right? So this is a very difficult task, and the cerebellum is not only engaged, but can differentiate between these different kinds of sentences. And what's more is that this doesn't just matter in some abstract sense in the scanner, it actually matters for behavior both inside the scanner and outside of the scanner. So individuals who maintain high levels of cerebellar activation on this task are actually the most accurate at these judgments of semantic plausibility, both within the scanner, and are better readers, better comprehenders, and are more fluent outside of the scanner. Okay. So hopefully you now also believe that the cerebellum plays a role in higher level language comprehension and processing. And so this kind of begs the question then, what about other higher order cognitive domains? And so one domain that I'm interested in is social learning, and this is often because language is learned in a social context. And so what we did for this study was we invited participants to come in and get brain scanned while they completed a ball toss task. And the participants thought that they were playing with other real people. They obviously weren't. And the point of the game here is to toss balls back and forth to these 3 other players. Over the course of the task, there emerges a good player who tosses the ball back to the participant quite often, and a bad player who does not like to share. He's unfair. He doesn't toss the ball back very often. And participants are really good at learning who to toss the ball to, even if you don't tell them this, right? So they very quickly stop tossing balls to the bad player and toss all of their balls to the good player. And when you look at learning on this task, it turns out that learning correlates with increased activity in parts of the brain like the hippocampus, which we know are important for learning and memory, but also this area right CRUS1, again, of the cerebellum. Okay, so now the question then becomes, what does the cerebellum do? What is it actually doing for language and cognition, and how is it doing this? And so for this, we can turn to the motor domain, where the cerebellum has been very, very well characterized over decades. And in the motor domain, it turns out that the cerebellum implements and houses what are called sensory motor internal models. And these are essentially representations of the sensory consequences of our actions. And they allow us to predict what the sensory consequence of an action is going to be without having to wait for sensory feedback, which is by definition delayed. And so they allow us to predict this and adjust our motion in real time, but also, if the feedback is not what we had expected, right, they allow us to update via prediction errors these models and better control our movement in the future. And neuroimaging has shown that sensory predictions are associated with very focal activation in motor regions of the cerebellum, and sensory prediction errors are associated with widespread activation throughout the cerebellum, thought to be important for suppressing all of those actions that we took in the first place that were wrong. Now, one really cool thing about the cerebellum is, unlike one of the very cool things of many of the cerebellum, is that unlike the cerebral cortex, the cytoarchitecture within the cerebellum is completely uniform throughout the entirety of the cerebellar cortex. So coupled with these ideas about cerebellar sensory motor internal models, this has led to several theories that maybe the cerebellum's also involved in implementing internal models for cognition. And so in the case of language, that might look something like this: being able to predict what it is that a conversational partner is going to say in real time, but also to adjust our predictions and maybe adjust our social behavior a little bit if what our linguistic partner says is not what we had expected in the first place. And so this is really important, not only for language, but also for social interaction. And so we've studied whether this might be the case in the cerebellum using, again, something like this sentence completion task. And here what we can do is we can modify how predictable a sentence is. So we can make it either very predictable, like 2 + 2 is 4, somewhat less predictable, or we can make it completely nonsensical and error-ridden. And then we can look at how the cerebellum responds to prediction and prediction error in the linguistic domain. And what we find is similar to the motor domain. Semantic predictions in the cerebellum are represented very focally, and they become more and more focal as the predictability of the sentence increases, particularly within language regions of the cerebellum. And semantic prediction errors are associated with the same kind of widespread activation pattern, again, primarily in language regions. So one problem with fMRI is that it is correlational in nature. And so a question you might have is, all right, but is the cerebellum really causal here? What is it contributing causally? And so for this, what we can do is turn to non-invasive neuromodulation. And one of the methods that we use is something called transcranial direct current stimulation, or TDCS. And this is a non-invasive and transient method of neuromodulation which delivers electrical current via electrodes that are placed on the scalp to participants. And you can experiment with polarity-specific effects. So you can inhibit or excite the cerebellum or the rest of the brain depending on how you place these electrodes. And what we did was something unique. We decided to do TDCS inside the scanner, so that we could not only examine the effects of cerebellar neuromodulation on behavior, but also on whole brain networks. And what we found was that depending on where you modulated the cerebellum, whether it was a motor region or kind of a higher order language region, you could have dissociable effects on behavior. So if you modulated motor regions of cerebellum, you could affect articulation of syllables. And if you modulated cognitive regions of cerebellum, you could affect semantic fluency. And in addition, we found that modulation of right crus1, this language region in the cerebellum, specifically increased activation in language regions of the cerebral cortex. So not the whole brain, but specific to language regions. It also increased functional connectivity, so connections between important nodes of the language network. And what was interesting is that neuromodulation was state dependent. So this means that it was most effective when predictive processing was necessary for language. So additional evidence then for this idea that the cerebellum is involved in prediction would come from something like this social learning task, where participants have to accumulate evidence over time to form kind of a prediction of who is a good and a bad player. And I'll just remind you on this ball toss task that usually, under no neuromodulation, participants are really good at differentiating good and bad players. But after neuromodulation of right crus1, what we found is that we could completely impair participants' ability to learn from their past experience to differentiate fair from unfair players. And not only could we affect their objective performance, like we do here, but we could also affect their subjective feelings of trust and preference to these players. Okay, so we and many others suggest then that the cerebellum is an optimization machine. It's important in forming predictions and optimizing actions in a given context. And so one question then is, okay, if it does that, how? How does cerebellar organization allow for this? In order to allow for this, the cerebellum would have to juggle both abstract goals, right, and representations, but also very concrete motor actions, right? And so it has to represent both prior experience action in any given moment, but also flexibly adapt depending on the context that you're in. And so some frameworks for this in the cerebral cortex suggest that these kinds of adaptive behaviors are organized hierarchically. And what that means is that parts become progressively more abstract over time. So at a very basic level, we have our actions, and they're very concrete. They're what we're doing in the moment. And so for language, this might be how we might move our mouths to respond to someone who is saying hello to us, right? But of course, we know that we don't always do the same thing in the given context. Context matters for our actions, and so the kind of greeting we might say in response to someone in a professional setting is very different than the greeting that we might say in a more casual setting. And on top of all of this, at the top of this kind of hierarchy, there's our overall goals. So our overall goals and our prior experiences that ultimately influence what we want out of a linguistic interaction and maybe our past experience with a conversational partner. In the cerebral cortex, these different aspects of cognition that ultimately support adaptive behaviors are represented along a gradient, moving from very concrete aspects of behavior, which are located close to motor regions of the cerebral cortex, located caudally, and moving rostrally towards the very, very most prefrontal aspects of prefrontal cortex. And interactions between these subregions in the prefrontal cortex are thought to support this kind of adaptive behavior. And these kinds of gradients are built on top of the intrinsic organization of our brain. So these are resting state networks, which also are organized in a gradient moving from very abstract to more concrete motor networks. Now, what we noted, and many others have noted in the past, is that the cerebellum is also organized in a very similar way along this gradient with very abstract networks, but also more concrete networks. And so maybe this kind of hierarchical organization in the prefrontal cortex extends to the cerebellum and might be what's allowing the cerebellum to represent both concrete actions, but also prior goals. And that's exactly what we found. So we found a very similar organization, whereby crus 1 and crus 2, these really abstract regions of cerebellum, represented our abstract goals. And as you moved closer to motor regions of the cerebellum, processing becomes more and more concrete. And again, interactions between these subregions were hierarchical in nature, with certain regions exerting top-down control over the processing in other regions. And what's really striking is how activation in these regions is related to behavior. So we can correlate activation in these regions with both behavior in the given moment, but also behavior in the future that hasn't yet happened at the point at which the activation is being measured. And in concrete regions, we see great correlations with what's happening in the moment, but not at all with what's happening in the future. We see the opposite pattern in these abstract regions, so they predict the kind of behavior that we're going to do in the future, but not in a given moment in the present. And these contextual regions are optimally positioned to mediate between both our goals and our actions, kind of driving actions that we want based on a goal in a given context. Okay, so if you're me and you've submitted this for publication and you're really excited, now you get the reviews back. And what the reviewers say is, well, that's all great, but you've told us that the cerebellum is reciprocally connected to the prefrontal cortex. So how do you know that your results aren't just mirroring what's really happening in the prefrontal cortex? Maybe this isn't happening in the cerebellum at all. And so to account for this, what we can do is we can look at how much of the variance and activation patterns in the cerebral cortex we can remove or account for in cerebellum before cerebellar interactions start to fall apart. So if the prefrontal cortex, so if this is just a reflection of what's happening in prefrontal cortex, then the minute you start varying out activation from prefrontal cortex, these interactions between cerebellar subregions should start to fall apart. But that's not actually at all what we saw. Instead, what we found is that we could vary a lot. We could remove a lot of the influence of prefrontal cortex before cerebellar subregions stopped interacting with each other. On the other hand, we found that the prefrontal cortex was very vulnerable to removing the influence of the cerebellum, and that actually interactions between prefrontal subregions fell apart very quickly when you started to control for cerebellar activation patterns. And so this suggests practically that we can account for unique contributions in these regions, but also that scientifically, the cerebellum's doing something different, right? So these are two parallel things that are happening in cerebral cortex and cerebellum. Okay, so I want to move now to kind of the applied part of this talk, and that is the role of the cerebellum in development and disorders. So clearly, language and social interaction are important for development, and they're affected in a great number of neurodevelopmental conditions, including autism. And so I want to turn back to this story that I told you at the beginning, and look back at the symptoms of this woman and point out that it seems as though the cerebellum might be particularly important for learning many of the skills that we need to learn early in development in order to have a successful developmental trajectory. And case studies such as this also help elucidate that principles of plasticity in the cerebellum might be different than principles of plasticity in the cerebral cortex. So in the cerebral cortex, damage early in life usually allows for plasticity and repair and pretty good outcomes later in life. But the opposite is true in the cerebellum, where actually damage early in life is associated with worse long-term function, including cognition, that is persistent throughout the lifespan. And so this suggests that the cerebellum might be really important for neurodevelopmental disorders. And in fact, cerebellar differences have been identified in several disorders, from dyslexia to psychosis to ADHD and to autism, which is what I want to talk to you briefly about today. So for those of you that don't know, autism is a neurodevelopmental condition, and it's characterized by two main diagnostic pillars: the presence of challenges with social interaction, as well as the presence of restricted or repetitive behaviors and interests. And language is really important because it contributes to both of these diagnostic criteria. And although many brain regions are important for autism, it turns out that the cerebellum is one of the most consistent sites of differences across neuroimaging, animal models, and postmortem studies of autism. And just to give you a sense of how important the cerebellum might be for autism, it turns out that cerebellar injury at birth increases the likelihood that someone will receive an autism diagnosis 36 times more than just being in the population, and more than having, for example, an autistic fraternal twin. And so we're interested in language, and so one of our questions was, is cerebellar structure and function actually important for language acquisition in autism? Early language delays are some of the first signs of autism, and so we were interested in using some sort of structural measures to look at these relationships. And what we found actually was the cerebellum, and no other part of the brain, just the cerebellum, actually was associated with language delays. So decreased gray matter, and primarily in this right crus1 region of the cerebellum, was associated with a later age of language acquisition in autistic kids. And across kids with autism, we also found that structural differences in the cerebellum, primarily again in this right crus1 and crus2 region, correlated with challenges in social interaction. But not just social interaction. So it turned out that reduced gray matter in the cerebellum was associated with increased challenges in all the core domains of autism, from repetitive behaviors to social communication to interaction. And reduced gray matter, the relationship between gray matter and these different domains, tended to cluster and converge on one region within the cerebellum. This, our good old friend, right crus1 of the cerebellum, which you've heard me mention many times today. And so we were interested in probing what it was about this region that might be so important. And so for this, we turned to collaborators at UT Southwestern who work with mouse models of autism, cerebellar mouse models of autism. And what we could do with these collaborators is invasively inhibit right crus1 of the cerebellum in mice and see what happened to social approach behaviors. So typically, mice spend a lot more time investigating a novel animal than they do a novel object. But what we found is that inhibition of right crus1 and right crus1 only could completely obliterate this typical social behavior. And when we probed what circuits were important for driving this behavior, we found that inhibition of right crus 1 was associated with abnormal increases in firing in the contralateral parietal lobe, which we know is important for a host of language and social functions. And what was striking is that when we turned to humans, we found a very similar pattern in human children, human autistic children and non-autistic children, whereby autistic children showed abnormal increases in connectivity between right crus 1 in this same region in the parietal lobe. Now, one thing we can do with mouse models is also stimulate, not just inhibit. And so in a mouse model of autism, the tuberous sclerosis 1 mouse model, these mice show atypical social approach behaviors. But stimulation of right crus 1 and right crus 1 only could actually rescue these social behaviors even into adulthood. And this really mirrors the effects of neuromodulation in neurotypical adults. So when we neuromodulate right crus 1 of the cerebellum, we can actually decrease connectivity in this cerebelloparietal circuit, which is atypically increased in the autistic children that I showed you. And just to give you a sense of the power of this method, we were able to decrease connectivity in this circuit in every single individual who received TDCS, shown here in blue, as opposed to kind of the average of the sham participants up here. And so this is interesting to us because it jives with several theoretical frameworks of autism, as well as self-reports of autistic individuals who tend to self-report that they have difficulties sometimes in predictive situations and predictive processing. And so some of our work now is linking the cerebellum to predictive processing differences, both strengths and challenges, and how predictive processing difficulties or differences in cerebellar organization are linked to relate to both challenges we see, as well as several strengths that we've identified in autistic individuals. Okay, and so the last thing I kind of want to tell you is a note of caution about interpreting challenges in autism. And that is that our ability to detect and interpret differences in autism, but really in general, are only as good as our tools. And typically in studies of language, we use pretty boring stimuli, which might not be that exciting for kids, and definitely not as exciting for kids with autism. And in fact, our stimuli might differentially engage our participant populations, and that's obviously not ideal. And so the question is, what if it doesn't have to be this way? What happens to brain differences if we actually use different methods to measure language? And so what we wanted to do for this study was personalize experiments to each individual child that came into our study. And the way we personalized them was by creating stories about each child's specific interests. So special interests are present in over 90% of children with autism. They're highly focused interests, things that are traditionally trains or Pokemon. Okay, and so what if, using these personalized neuroimaging stories, we can actually get better brain activation and happier kids in our studies? And so we have a lot of subjects, but just in the interest of time, I'll show you one. This is a girl. She's interested in trains, but not just trains. She's interested in the Purple Line commuter train in Boston, okay, the MBTA. And so this is what her brain looks like when she's listening to just stories about nature. And you can see that we have no cerebellar activation here. But this is what her brain looks like when she's listening to her special interest story. So not only do we massively increase the magnitude of activation in the cerebral cortex, but all of a sudden, this region of the cerebellum that we thought was atypical or abnormal starts to pop up too. And when you do the direct comparison, it's incredibly robust and incredibly statistically significant. It highlights the cerebellum, several regions of the language network, in addition to reward regions of the brain like the striatum and the VTA, which we also usually think are atypical in autistic kids and adults. And what's really striking is the activation to special interest was not only more robust, but also more consistent across individuals, despite the fact that all of their stimuli were idiosyncratic. right? Suggesting that maybe we've controlled for level of interest and engagement across our individuals. And so we're really interested in my lab in following this up further. Okay, and so I'll summarize, and I want to leave you with a few take-home messages and then a call to action. And so I'll end by saying that the cerebellum is clearly an understudied region in cognition, but differences both in structure and function are related to both typical and atypical language and social communication, with the caveat that the way we do these experiments really matters. And the second point is that the cerebellum maybe houses and implements internal models for language, and that this might be achieved through what I'm calling a hierarchical organization, whereby different cerebellar subregions interact to support complex cognition. Okay, and now the call to action, all right? And that is that if you're a researcher, or if you're reading published work, to kind of hunt for cerebellar contributions. So often we report a brain region that we're really interested in. For example, the prefrontal cortex is a famous one that we really think is involved in cognition. And other regions go in supplementary tables, and no one really ever looks at them. But when you do look at them, what you actually find is that often the cerebellum is as significantly, if not more significantly activated than several of the regions that we often report. So the cerebellum, if you look through those supplementary tables, is often one of the most significantly active regions in the brain, but seldom the star of the show. And so the second call to action is to think about what we may be missing in our figures, in our frameworks, and in our thoughts about the brain when we are excluding the cerebellum. And so if you're interested in figuring that out, I'm always looking for collaborators and staff and students to help kind of solve these issues. And so I'd like to thank my lab, many of whom are here today, as well as the collaborators, mainly the participants and their families who actually make this research possible, and my funding sources. And I'd be happy to take any questions or comments.
Wow, thank you. It looks like the frontal lobe has some competition for favorite brain region. We're frontal lobe people around here, so that was so interesting. Okay, we are going to kick off questions, and I see one right here.
Thank you, Doctor. My name is Jack. My takeaway from your presentation is I'm highly encouraged as a person and as a father, so thank you. I want to go back to your presentation and focus on the comments you made about the cerebellum as part of the internal modeling, and then talk about the optimization component, the engine, the machine, and lastly, the autism system disorder, ASD. To do that, let me tell you very quickly my story, and then talk about my son, John, who's 30. I'm profoundly deaf. At age 4 in 1966, my parents first learned that I was profoundly deaf. So my brain was not properly forming. Long story short, I learned through technique and training to rely on my eyes to offset my hearing loss. So through my brain, I was trained both directly and indirectly to allow my brain to help my eyes overcome my hearing loss. My question now, my son, John, he's outwardly considered autistic. He just turned 30 years old earlier this month. He has a rare disease called histiocytosis. Are you familiar with that? Most people are not. And long story short, he's living in a group home. My wife and I feel that we never really, with the doctor's help, starting with Children's Medical Center, ending with Cook Children's of the past 25 years, and down with Baylor Medical Center in Houston, never thought about looking at the brain and see if the brain can help offset his autistic-like tendencies and lifestyle. So my question is, could we look at the cerebellum as a possible source for a solution for John through this connection with autism-like tendencies that's called histiocytosis?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks for sharing your story. So I'm not a clinician, right? I'm not a real doctor, right? I'm a researcher. And so I don't know, in individual cases, right, how brain differences might relate to different kinds of symptomology. But I do know that when it comes to brain scans in general, and I think that's something that BrainHealth is really good at, we don't often do brain scans, as the course of business for medical treatment, and so maybe that's something that should change over time. And when it comes to the cerebellum specifically, even when we do look at the brain, it often tends to be excluded. So a good example is I went to a talk of a woman who worked in a clinic with premature infants, and they just weren't even acquiring cerebellar data. And these infants were at high risk for cerebellar hemorrhages at birth. They were coming back again and again and again with a host of issues. And they just didn't even have the data that the cerebellum might play a role because they weren't even acquiring it because of this dogma that, it's so involved in motor behaviors. And many of them received diagnoses of dyslexia and autism later in life. So, to kind of indirectly address your point, yeah, I think it's always important to look at the full picture of the brain and get as much data as we want, both for the individual and for the group.
Brain scans over a period of 20 years. When I would ask the neurooncologist, the researcher, what is this telling you? And that's why I put out the Chapman. Your comment about the measurement tools may be an inhibitor. They could not answer my questions. They don't know what they're seeing either.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. Yes, I agree with you, definitely. Yeah.
All right, we have some questions from our virtual audience. This one is asking, when there is damage to the cerebellum, is there automatically damage done to the prefrontal cortex, given these connections you were talking about?
Yeah, so in premature infants or in infants who are born with cerebellar damage, so cerebellar strokes to the cerebellum, you do see these kind of trophic interactions, so connected regions of the cerebellum, so like the left hemisphere of the cerebral cortex, if the right hemisphere is damaged, do shrink in size. So there are relationships between the brain, always. It's unclear, right, how much that affects processing, and the brain is clearly very adaptive, and so, right, yeah, so you might see different things depending on what part of the cerebellum is affected. Yeah.
Very interesting, it's all connected. Okay, we have another question over here.
Okay, excellent talk, I really enjoyed it. I'm becoming converted toward the cerebellum now. What really struck me with your imaging data was how much activity was associated with context, as you had called it.
Yeah.
Really mediating the expectations versus the actions. And I wonder if you could comment more, would that be the context in terms of a motor task or a language task or both? Just kind of how specific is that?
Yeah, so the task is the task that we used in this is the reason, I don't go into it is it's a complicated task. It's essentially a language task that manipulates different cues to try and kind of get at these different aspects of cognition. But speaking to your broader point about context, in the cerebellum, this is basically, the task basically for the contextual condition is asking you to adapt your behavior, choose which action to do depending on which cue you're seeing. So this kind of flexible adaptation. And what you notice is that in cerebellum, but also in the cerebral cortex, those green context regions overlap with what is the frontoparietal network. So this is kind of this like cognitive flexibility task on network. In the cerebellum, it turns out that the amount of real estate devoted to that network, and both in task and in resting state, is way more proportionately than in the cerebral cortex. So more of the cerebellum is doing this kind of switching, potentially, this adaptive kind of processing than the cerebral cortex. Yeah.
Anila, thank you. Tremendous. It's so nice to have you here and hear this tremendous research and help us expand the way we ask questions. So one of the things that we're looking for is a marker of the brain getting better in health, but also with people that have different compromises and, looking at, brain blood flow, connectivity, and the hemodynamic response. Would you say that you feel like there could be, I have a two-part question, mechanisms within the cerebellum that we should be adding to this that may be a trigger before the brain changes, that one happens before the other in this sequence, or that they're co-combining? And then the second one is, if we're looking at ways to enhance performance, even though you're not a clinician, would you think stimulating the cerebellum might be a way, depending on the level of deficits, to get sort of this enhanced benefit when you combine it with cognitive trainings?
Yeah, for sure. So I think stimulating the cerebellum is a great way to go. So the parts of the cerebellum that do cognition are pretty accessible to neuromodulation, unlike regions like the medial prefrontal cortex. And the cerebellum is connected to almost every brain region, so it's a great area to target for any sort of modulation. Both kind of in the motor domain, improving motor function, and cognitive domain, we have kind of evidence that you can modulate the cerebellum both up and down when it comes to performance. So yes, I always think that people should be looking at the cerebellum. And in terms of kind of targeting it before or after, I think, that many people here study brains as networks, and so it's also just important to consider that the cerebellum, even if it's not better or worse than the cerebral cortex, is part of that whole network. And so, if you're interested in the default mode network, the cerebellum contains a node of that network. If you're interested in motor networks, the cerebellum contains a node of that network too. And so to just make sure that we're considering that it's part of these greater networks, whether that's for modulation and improvement or for basic science, I think is really important. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take another question from our online audience. So with the connections being so dense between the cerebellum and cerebrum, do you think that this is talking about rehab for a cerebral stroke, particularly in Wernicke's aphasia? Could you see benefit from strengthening connections within the cerebellum? And if so, how would you do that? And I know you're not a clinician, but.
Yeah. So one of the studies I showed was actually in collaboration with a neurologist at Georgetown, Peter Turkeltaub, who works in aphasia. And the point of that was really that there was some literature showing that the right lateralized cerebellum, like right crus 1, showed increased activation in people who were recovering from strokes and who had aphasia. And so part of the study was this proof of principle to see if increasing activation via neuromodulation of these cerebellar regions could actually affect language behaviors. And so it seems like it can. The beauty of cerebellum is that if you have strokes to the left hemisphere cerebral regions, that tissue is gone or is damaged, and so neuromodulation targets are sparse. And so if we know that the cerebellum is also very involved in these same aspects of language, then maybe it provides this nice kind of tissue that is still active to drive activation in the rest of the brain. Yeah, good question.
Okay, another question from the audience.
Yeah, just to follow up on the contextual question, especially in the example that you showed that had them almost trusting, from what it looked like, they were trusting the bad ball throwers more so than the trustworthy ball throwers. And so my brother is autistic, and I would definitely say, at least observationally, watching the friends or the people that he chooses to associate with may not always have his best interests at heart. So is this something that we can build on? Just that correlation is very interesting, that they were almost trusting the wrong people more.
Yeah. So I think in that study, they were trusting, the wrong people slightly more and trusting the good people slightly less, and it all just kind of washed out to lack of differentiation overall. So I think, one issue, right, so when we're thinking about cerebellar contributions specifically to something like autism, you think, well, maybe if the cerebellum is really involved in kind of implicitly picking up on what's happening in your environment and using that implicit knowledge to build representations of then how to act in the future, that then for something like autism and social learning, that would be really important. And so this is just one task, but we see it in a lot of other domains. There's not a lot of clear links between social learning and autism specifically and cerebellum, so that's something that we're interested in doing, and several of the girls here are actually doing now. So yeah.
Another virtual question, which I think this is important to touch on, just given my experience with neuromodulation and transcranial current stimulation, like you talked about. And so this person wrote in, we saw brain stimulation and therefore increased function. Would continued stimulation continue to improve function?
I don't know. That's a great question, and we should do the science and find out. So usually with something like TDCS or TMS, the gold standard would be to do many sessions of that neuromodulation and then kind of measure these pre-post changes. This was kind of like a single shot, 20 minutes of TDCS and then looking very quickly after. So I think, if you were interested in using TDCS therapeutically, you would probably want to make sure you were getting the best benefit, possible.
Yeah, and you have to consider kind of changes over time and how long that lasts, and if you need to re-up, and understand that more does not always necessarily equal better. So, word of caution. Sandy.
So I have another question. So can you sit right here? No, Anila. Wow. So I'm just thinking, I wish Maria was here. I don't know if part of her team is that does our work with autism and charisma and doing online training, where we've shown very significant changes, and even prior to that, brain changes in sort of these temporal parietal just in 10 hours by having people engage. But I'm wondering if using the stimulation of the cerebellum either prior to or during, because we still don't know whether the stimulation helps to prime it to benefit from training, or do you do it when, or exactly what the sequence is, because we've worked with a little bit of that. But what would you think that, if you're doing this kind of social cognitive training where they get better and the brain's changing, that what sort of timing do you think it could elevate the impact of what's going on?
Yeah, so I think it's still unclear. We have examples, kind of like this question where you do neuromodulation and people get better, and then examples of entire tasks where neuromodulation made them get worse. So you can do it in the scanner while they're doing a task, you could do it after, you can do it before. I think there's a host of things that you would need to really parametrically kind of check off the list. And then the other thing too is, with autism specifically, right, what would be the kind of endpoints that you would be looking for? So do you necessarily want to change social function in an individual maybe who is interacting well but differently, with the risk being that whenever you change some part of the brain, something else might change too, and you just don't know what that is.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying, because we found in some of our TDCS that actually the stimulation made them worse in the area because we chose the wrong area, perhaps, in terms of what happened. So it downregulated the benefits. So it's knowing where. It's not just all's good, as people are taking it off the internet now to stimulate their brain. So, thank you.
Okay, we have I think time for maybe one more question. And so this one is about dementia, and could the loss of language due to dementia involve the cerebellum?
I'm sure, so I think my approach to science is always to take a whole brain approach, and that is to say that, every region is probably working in concert to support both the really high level abilities we have and also the intensely, debilitating disabilities that come from things like dementia. So I don't know specifically for something like dementia, but I would urge anyone to definitely look at the whole brain when it comes to several disorders. Yeah.
Okay, any last questions from our live audience? Oh, one over here.
So you were saying that cerebellum trauma or injury in babies can be linked to autism. What kind of injury would that be? What would people have to look out for to make sure that they don't injure their infant's cerebellum?
Yeah, so I think first, it might not be linked to autism directly, but it definitely increases, many signs that ultimately might increase your likelihood of getting diagnosed with autism. And I don't think this is injury, their babies got hurt. Usually these are strokes that occur in utero or perinatally. So the cerebellum is a very vulnerable region for these kind of hemorrhagic strokes that can occur. They're more common, for example, in premature infants. But yeah, there's nothing that we could really, necessarily do, I think, to prevent that, unfortunately, at least not yet.
Great question. Okay, we're going to wrap up. So thank you again. One more time, please. Can we have a round of applause for Dr. Anila? Lifelong brain health is our shared mission, and so thank you for opening our eyes to further appreciate the cerebellum and have that holistic brain health approach. And so we want to thank everyone in person and online for joining us today. We will be back again on May 5th with Dr. Richard Golden. He is a leading researcher in the field of theoretical and applied statistical machine learning, and he will be discussing inferring causal relationships from observational data sets. So we'll see you then. Thanks.